Welcome to Next Round with me, Dale McDermott.
And me, David W. Higgins.
A young Irish look at the economy, politics and society.
Covering home and abroad.
For the thinkers, the dreamers and the doers, this is Next Round. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Next Round. Today, a few items on our agenda. We want to talk about density with respect to housing and how does it relate to fertility. Does it mean we actually need to build more homes outside of major urban areas such as Dublin? And David has a number of figures which we'd love to explore. Also, councils have been really the big buyers of property in recent times, not investment funds or vulture funds, as has been colloquially described. So with that, we want to explore that. And also crime. Crime is up significantly, with shoplifting having risen to its highest level in 20 years here in England and also Wales. And we want to go and explore the rising levels of crime across Ireland and the UK as well. If you did like this podcast, please like it, please share it, and please follow us across all major audio platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. You can watch us on YouTube as well. Your support means a lot to us as we continue to grow and build this community. But let's dive into it. And I think the first piece we want to talk about is crime. And shoplifting has risen to its highest levels, as I mentioned, in 20 years here in England and in Wales, up 30% this year alone, alongside a rising spate in street theft, according to new data which has been released by the Office of National Statistics here in the UK, which is the CSO equivalent back in Ireland. David, just some points to call out here. So there has been about a 40% increase in what's called theft from the person, which is basically things like bag snatching and mobile phone theft. That's not exactly using a threat or violence, it's just taking it and going. Since living here, what I've been told is that, you know, when you're walking along the streets in central London, the worst thing you can possibly do is to have your phone out because it'll just be taken. People will just cycle by and take it. And this is, the data shows it, but it's also something which I've just known about from friends who live here. Just the amount of people who have had their phones stolen is pretty unbelievable.
Did you have that advice to you when you lived in Toronto in Canada?
No. I petty crime in Canada was just not exactly to the levels that I'm actually quite shocked at here. And the data shows, up to the period of March this year, about 443,000 cases were reported of these shoplifting offences. Is one category as well, which is up 61% in 2 years. And again, that's just on elements that are being reported. And just to show how naive I was on this, in my local area where I live in, I live in pretty central London, and in my local co-op store, which is a pretty standard retail grocery store, what I noticed is in the area where you buy your laundry, detergent and dishwasher tablets, all that sort of stuff, all of the boxes that are there are on display. So they only have display. And I always naively thought that they were just consistently out of stock and there was a supply chain issue and this must have been a Brexit issue. Until recently, it was pointed out to me that actually, no, if you actually want to purchase dishwasher tablets, for example, you have to ask for them to be brought from behind the counter because of shoplifting. The levels of shoplifting across central London are unbelievable. And
The extreme cases I've seen of that, you see clips sometimes of places like San Francisco or other American cities where you have heavy percentage of items behind plastic or behind a keyed, a locked case, essentially, and staff need to go and unlock it for you if you want something. So you're seeing that there. Would I be right in saying again you didn't see that in Toronto when you lived there as much?
Canada, no, yeah, like the levels of petty crime were just significantly lower. There was a good police presence, though, is a point I would also bring to light here as well. If you're to ask yourself, well, look, what are the causes of this? A constant theme which is thrown out is the things like the cost of living and the economic challenges that people are facing. I mean, but I certainly believe that presence on the ground is something as well, which is pretty important here. If you look at police numbers from 2010 up until now, in 2010 there are about 143,000 police officers in England. As of last year, there are 147,000 police officers. Now, at the same time, population has increased by about nearly 10% over that 13-year period, while police numbers have not. They've basically remained more or less the same. And if you look at Ireland as well, I mean, Ireland has also seen, an increase in this levels of low-level crime. So if you look at data released by the CSO for Q1 of this year, it shows that crime incidents reported being the key word there of robbery, extortion, hijacking offences, are up 18% on the same period, and elements with respect to fraud and other related offences also rising by about 9%, and areas related to burglary and similar items were up about 6%. Policing numbers in Ireland, of course, similar to the UK, went through a period of significant cutting in its public finances with respect to policing. And just to bring this to light, David, in Ireland 2010, there are about 14,377 Gardaí across the country. Fast forward to just last year, there were just over 14,000 police officers. But in that same period of time, the population of Ireland has increased about 16%. Adding about 730,000 people across the country. So, the point I want to make here, David, and I think the question I want to just explore with you is, I really think this is becoming a pretty big issue in the UK and in Ireland. And I think I'm curious to explore some of the questions around, why is this happening? Dublin city centre is often referred to as a bit of a war zone sometimes with respect to kind of the levels of petty crime and antisocial behaviour that's happening, and the damage that can have, I think, on wider society.
Yeah, I mean, coming out of COVID, it seems that the timelines of this very much link back to COVID. The claim you see made often enough is that because you had a lot of young, disgruntled kids who had to stay home in their family homes, but actually couldn't go out and roam the streets with their friends, that only exacerbated the potential that any of these kids might have had to go off and commit crime. Very often you would have had kids actually having to stay in with parents that they wouldn't have gotten along very very well with, and in some cases they might have been subject to some abuse. So having those kids back out in the street then in the years after COVID may have contributed towards that. There's also the question of, the kids are obviously back in school, but are kids actually staying in school, and are they actually, completing their education? That can also be a factor that leads people towards petty crime as well.
Yeah, truancy is a big issue here in the UK as well, and I was reading this recently with respect to in London the amount of kids who actually are missing school. And in parts of London, for example, areas around, let's say, Camden, Croydon, and also Westminster as well, in fairly central London, that can go as high as 27% of people of kids who are regularly defined as missing school. And that's about, the national average is as high as 25%. So 1 in 4 kids in England are regularly missing school. And I think, we've obviously focused our podcast, David, a lot on the latter parts of life, and how education and economic development and how all of our economic situation then can affect fertility and the wider parts of life. But it's elements like this, back to youth, that I think are really also important in this conversation. And they're worrying figures. And it also makes life, I think, somewhat unbearable for many people in our urban centres. And with populations going to increase, and with people looking for more movement into city centres, and I know we'll talk about urban density in a moment, it's a real problem, and I don't think it's getting the airtime and focus point that it needs.
It's going to put people off these cities. If all these cities, some US ones, London, as you mentioned, and Dublin, are all seeing increases in these petty crimes, and these are cities which, by the way, are quite expensive. You know, typically the people who are living in these cities, if you can afford to live in these cities, tend to be higher rate taxpayers who are paying good money to the state to fund a justice system, to fund a policing system. And, you know, the expectation is there that their streets be kept safe. And if they aren't, there's a big disconnect there between what those voters are asking for and what the state is delivering for them. You know, a theme that I'm coming back to when I talk about the election that'll come up in Ireland later this year is the theme of security. And I mean that kind of in the broadest sense.
Yeah.
So secure streets, secure borders, but also secure incomes, you know, getting cost of living down, security of public service delivery, secure housing, getting people the keys to their homes. All of this points to, I think, a desire amongst the electorates across the world to have governments that they know can deliver modest changes, but not completely turn their lives upside down. And if you live in an area where you've seen a big increase in crime, it can turn your life upside down, where you end up in a very agitated mindset towards people, you know, your fellow young people on the street, and that, you know, really erodes social trust. I mean, one thing that kind of developed Western societies build on quite strongly is the idea of trust, that we can walk down our streets and actually trust the people who are walking by, and that we don't live in a constant state of mistrust. And that can cause all kinds of frictions in people's lives and can actually cause frictions in the economy as well. You know, good business dealings build on trust. So if you're mistrusting of the people in your community, I think you're going to be less trusting of the people you may do business with too. So it's a real incumbency on governments to actually get this under control, particularly local police services as well.
And yeah, I think it's, you know, the question goes around, are people reaching a bit of a breaking point as well? And with that, then, you know, I think we saw in Ireland, Fine Gael in government have made this jolt towards law and order, getting things settled, and really taking a bit of a harder line on crime. Now, the backdrop to that is, you know, there are numerous policy, I'd go as far to say, as failings with respect to security and crime in Ireland. And, you know, we saw the various public backlashes, but also incidents of major public disorder taking place. We've seen as well more recently, even in the last week, what's happening in Coolock, and how all of that then ties to take your security thread, David, and pull it, you know, the piece around that's tied to immigration and secure borders. And so I think that's a really interesting point about security and how that plays broadly across society, and be it their locality, where they live, the area that they walk in, the place where they buy their groceries, to the country that they live in, the economic situation that they're in. I think that has a real mindset which permeates into, I think, all facets of their lives. So
yes, and the point on that worth mentioning is just what Sinn Féin have done yesterday with their document.
That's right.
On
the document with no numbers.
No, now they followed up this morning by putting a number on the cost of immigration staff. So just the backdrop, Sinn Féin have put out a policy. The policy is a document says that, look, we should not be putting migration centres in any deprived areas, and then more in middle class areas, but that there should be better consultation. You should be looking at metrics such as availability of GPs and school places before you actually put 500 asylum seekers in any one given area. Now, I could dig deeper into the politics of that, but just keeping it on the theme of
Hmm.
crime and security, it is very much a sign that, okay, a left-wing party here is now starting to talk about this. They can see the frustration that is there amongst communities which are also feeling the brunt. I mean, it's deprived communities that often see the highest spike in crime, because perpetrators of crime very often will pick on their own communities just as much as going into wealthier city centre areas and pickpocketing there. So it is those communities that feel the brunt of this too. So the onus is very much now. I think it's interesting that you have Sinn Féin, left-wing party, and then the Labour Party in the UK, who are now taking over, also left-wing party. Crime and security issues are falling on their doors. It's going to be maybe not Sinn Féin will be in government, but Labour Party in the UK are, and they're going to have to all grapple with these issues too.
Yeah, this whole piece ties into the whole idea of this social contract. We've spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about the social contract and how it's been kind of broken, in that people don't have the ability to get into the housing market, and feel like they own part of the country, and then how that affects, even to going as far as how do they vote then, going forward. The security piece is also a big issue, and trust is broken down. And when people, even the stats around reporting, like people don't even bother reporting stuff now, which can actually then inflate and make statistics around crime look better than they actually are, because, well, people then think, well, what's the point? And why should I even bother reporting this? And I think that can have a bit of a circular flow. It's something, David, which I think we should keep an eye on as we keep on having these conversations, because I think it's worrying. And I think as we look for the younger generation as well, when we have a situation where, in the UK, I don't know the numbers for Ireland, but in England, where 1 in 4 kids are regularly missing school, that's going to have a knock-on effect for, education, for going to university, for wider productivity and growth. But then again, also that social contract and that social buy-in that people need to have, that, there's a question around, well, why aren't they going to go to school? And how does that compare to previous years? So all that said, I think pretty interesting.
Yeah.
With that, let's move from crime to fertility and housing. So, David, I know we're looking at some data here with respect to how the density of an area correlates to the fertility rates within that local area. And the question is, do we need to start building and buying places outside of metro areas like Dublin? But David, you have the numbers. Go ahead.
Thanks, Dale. So the CSO had a piece yesterday looking at the births and deaths by local electoral area. People will be familiar with their LEA from the COVID years, when you could dig into the number of cases in your own area. I know many family members who used to always log in and check in on those numbers. But what the CSO have published is births in the year 21. So it's a little bit lagged, but it tells us a very interesting picture by density. So they looked at a fertility rate, which is a crude number. So sometimes we talk about fertility, it's usually like births per woman in total in their life. So that could be 2 per woman, essentially. This is looking at it's just a different metric, right? So it's looking at the number of births per 1,000 women aged between 15 and 49. We can forget about what exactly that means, but if I'll tell you the high numbers and I'll tell you the low.
Yeah.
So the areas that had the highest were Carrick-on-Shannon with 61.2 births per 1,000, and Enniscorthy in County Wexford at 60.8, and then Ballybay-Clones in County Monaghan at 60.6. They had the highest fertility, right? And that's roughly around 60, let's call it.
Theme there being rural.
Rural, yeah. These areas are not especially urban. I mean, Carrick-on-Shannon and Enniscorthy are also towns.
They might be known for stag and hen parties, but not. That's about it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but these places would also have. There wouldn't be a high density in these towns, and this would also capture the area surrounding them, which would also be rural. So just to bear that in mind. But then let's look at the flip side. So I was mentioning figures there in around 60 per 1,000. We're going to jump right down to 30. So these are numbers that are half of these highest ones. Wow. At the bottom of the list urban LEAs, Southeast Inner City in Dublin, 29.8, Galway City Central, 30.5, and then North Inner City in Dublin of 31.1. So the point here is you have some of the most urban parts of the country with the lowest fertility, and then some of the most some of the least urban areas, or at least areas that are certainly not urban, or at least dense urban, with the higher fertility rates. And the point this gets to is that there is in international evidence a decent correlation between fertility and density, such that really dense areas struggle to have high fertility. So I was looking at a couple of cities around the world where this is the case. The lowest fertilities you can find are in places like Shanghai and Seoul in South Korea, where you're talking about fertility rates that can be as low as, I think it's 0.55 in Seoul in South Korea, which is crazy low. And that's below their national average of 0.72. If you look at Tokyo, you'll find that it's around one, just under one. That's birth per woman, fertility rate of one. But the national average in Japan will be somewhere like 1.2. So again, the more urban the area, the more below it is the national average. There's some cities in the US here that you can look at. If you have places like Houston, Dallas, these are places that are not very dense, so they have a lot of housing as opposed to apartments. Philadelphia, Washington D.C., these places typically have less than 40% apartments.
It's a classic suburban, like if you think of, quintessential suburban American life, it's those huge suburban areas with very big homes. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And these cities, like all these cities, are below replacement rate, below 2.0, 2.1. But you'll get higher fertility in these places in the realm of like 1.7, 1.8, even 1.9. But when you look at the lower end cities that are kind of in the 1.123 area, you're seeing the likes of Rome, Madrid, Barcelona, Istanbul, Moscow's up there. All of those cities I just mentioned have over 80% of their residents, households, living in apartments. So they're much more apartment living cities than they are housing style cities. And then you can do this by country as well. Ireland, people be interested to know, less than 10% of housing in Ireland is apartments. And we have slightly higher fertility. It's listed in this chart as 1.7.
Yeah.
It's actually closer to 1.5 nowadays. This might be a year or two behind this chart that I'm using to tell you all this. But then you go to likes of Spain, Greece, Switzerland, places that are kind of on average around 60% apartment living. Their fertility is around like 1.3. I'm rounding here. But the point being is that there actually seems to be this trade-off between having high fertility and having high density. Now, what does that then tell you about housing? What I think it tells you is that you can't go all in on apartment living. You do need to have a decent share of your households living in a spread of more suburban and rural areas. So the trajectory that Ireland's on, I think, is not a trajectory I would change. We are building a lot more apartments nowadays, particularly in Dublin, and that's needed because our share of apartment living is so damn low. Because for years we've been growing jobs in the Dublin area, but not growing households. So you've had a lot of urban sprawl, people living outside in the kind of commuter belts and having to commute into the city centre to work. All of that, whilst it may be more supportive of fertility because you'd have a larger house and you have a community that's a little more spread out, and that might be better for having kids. The lifestyle that many parents lead is quite challenging, whereby people can have 90-minute commutes both ways. Life is tougher for that reason. So it speaks to how going all in on apartment living is probably the wrong way to go. But we do need to actually rebalance in some respects. Now, would that rebalancing, if we actually, that trajectory that we're on, is that going to even further worsen our fertility rate? So at 1.55, as I mentioned, in Ireland, we are expected to notch even lower to 1.3 by the 2030s. This was modelling that came out within that CSO population forecast that we talked about before, potentially going to a population of 7 million. A falling fertility rate there may actually reflect that, yes, Ireland is going to become more urban. But with that, we may pay the price of actually end up having fewer kids per family.
But shouldn't, my view on this is, the housing policy and blend that we have of dwellings, it should match the phase of people's lives. So, in your early 20s, in your 20s, you're probably got you generally being in an apartment if you're in a metro area in the city center, either sharing or by yourself, depending on the circumstance. I know in Ireland, obviously, given the circumstance, it's quite expensive to do that. You find a partner. You then move in together in an apartment. You might have a kid in that apartment. And as your family size and life scales change, you would then move from the city centre out and out and out into wider spaces. And then perhaps then when you're older and everyone's left and you're now empty nesters, then you have the opportunity then to maybe trade down in size and not have to have a big empty home with 5 bedrooms or whatever. So I think apartment living has a real role to play, and it's affordable, and it's more affordable than a 3-bed semi in lots of cases. That's one element. But then the other element then also, and this is where I think Ireland has really fallen down, is on transport policy and infrastructure to make, commuting from metro centres out into areas with, better living in terms of size. People don't want to be driving 2 hours each way stuck in traffic. People want to have access to, rail that's at a higher speed. People want to have access to subways and metros, which aren't there right now. So I think both of those are actually key points in this discussion, which I think Ireland has not done itself justice in.
Yeah, I think as I said there, I think that moving towards higher apartment living makes sense. What I think the challenge is this is a global problem. Fertility has fallen everywhere. So if you were to wind the clock back to the 1960s, 70s, the structure of these countries that I mentioned, like Ireland being heavy on home living and Spain being heavy on apartment living, that was still the case then. It hasn't been that suddenly Spain built a ton of apartments in the past 40 years and saw their fertility fall. And Ireland, despite having very few apartments, is below replacement fertility as well. So the thing that will take the entire curve up and take all countries up is probably something very different. Now, within that, you'll probably, actually that in some respects speaks to Ireland having some potential here. If global fertility picks up, our fertility might actually, pop above 2 sooner than it might in Spain and some other countries, which could be quite fruitful for us if that happens. So I think that this, while it is a good explainer of fertility within a country, it probably doesn't explain the global problem. And there are other factors that are probably needed to change to actually take the whole line up across the world. But
also, I think it's reflective of people's living situations, right? I mean, if you're again in your 20s living in an apartment, I think the question here is age as well. Like, how is age reflective in this data as well? Like, people are probably at a higher proportion earlier in their life, and maybe not just at that phase where they want to have kids, which means that the fertility rate is, artificially lower than, let's say, later on in their life.
The thing to mention about some of this data is that I mentioned that urban areas in Ireland had the lowest fertility of the LEAs, but actually the number of births, if you take somewhere, I think it was the North Inner City, had the highest number of births of any of the LEAs. But that speaks to the fact that while the rate is low, the share of young people living in these LEAs is actually quite high.
Yeah.
So you may have a small proportion of births, but they can actually be a high number. And it speaks to the fact that because urban centres in Ireland, particularly Dublin, are typically where you have a lot of any kind of short-term workers, people who are coming in and out of the country, working for multinationals. Anyone who's come from abroad who may ultimately decide that building their family roots are done in a different country. For that reason, you'll have a distorted picture where there's actually quite a high share of young people, but just a lower share of births.
Yeah, fascinating. And then on the theme of housing then, David, we also want to talk about who is buying up property in Ireland. And new data shows from last year that it's not the investment funds or vulture funds who've been painted with that brush. It's actually councils.
Yes. So this is data that we get on what's called non-household market purchases. And this is another CSO release from yesterday. And what they have put out is for 2023, the number of properties that were purchased by basically anybody other than a household. So most property purchases are household. Usually someone sells a house and another individual buys it. This is where you might have a house being sold and a non-householder buys it, or a non-householder might be selling and then a household buys it. They can go in different directions. But what I'm going to talk about here is the purchases by non-householders, because this is where the controversy has been. Are investment funds coming in and totally taking over the purchasing of properties in Ireland, and is that crowding out young first-time buyers trying to get on the property ladder? And at least the 2023 data suggests no. So they break out the purchases. First, let's look at the total number. The total number in 22 was 13,500 purchases, and now we're down to just over 12,000. So we're down by over 1,000 purchases year on year. Now, you go back to the year 2017, there was only less than 9,000 purchases by non-householders. So this trend has elevated. It's moved up over the years. We're down year on year, but we are up over a couple of years. But the mix of purchases really matters. So if you look at something like the financial sector, which is one of the sectors, their purchases in 2022 was 4,000. It was only just over 2,000 in 2023. So the number purchased by financial sector funds almost halved. Now, there are other buyers in there too that are kind of, let's say, close to the idea of funds. So the real estate group, which purchased over 2,000 homes in 2022, purchased just over 1,000 last year. So that was also way down. But and there were some other smaller sectors like what's called extraterritorial. That's where a fund might be domiciled outside of Ireland and purchases from outside in. They don't actually re-register their fund within Ireland. That number was only just over 822, and it was down to 600 last year. So also a decline under that.
All declining. I think just the notes to point out there is that they're all declining as they go on in time, which is since 2022.
At least from 22 to 23.
Yeah.
Now, what I think this was interest rates. So when interest rates went up, being a property fund became much more difficult because your ability to borrow cheap and put your money into property, that attractiveness went way down. So suddenly funds are now saying, well, actually, I should buy government bonds instead. It might be a better return. And actually, because property prices in 23 were not flat, but they weren't above the rate of income growth, for example. Many funds are now beginning to look and say, okay, if rates are higher, the potential growth on the property assets that you buy is just not as strong either. So this speaks to how COVID probably pumped a lot of money into the financial system. The ECB, they cut interest rates, the QE. That was a real boom for financial sector funds looking to do this. Now it's turning the other way.
So where are most of the numbers going then, David? So if they're decreasing from finance and insurance, who's actually making the purchases?
The big purchaser, that big group of purchasers that went higher is the public sector. Public sector, education, health, social care. This is there's three sectors here grouped together. They went from just 4,400 in 22 to nearly 5,800 in 23. So there was a substantial increase of purchases from there. Now we can split this out further. So amongst that 5,800, you're talking about just 2,000, which are the broad public sector. So that would definitely capture things like local councils.
And that's local councils buying is that like buying them for social housing?
Yes, yeah. Okay. So councils have been doing this over a couple of years.
They have.
Yeah, going in, going basically to, and there'd be someone
bidding against the private market. I would add, I know someone close to me who was trying to buy their first home a number of years ago, and they entered a bidding war. And the bidding war was not against another couple trying to buy their first home. It was actually a council, and the council just kept on adding until they successfully won.
Yeah, and the budget of councils is going to be a much greater capacity than it's going to be for a private buyer.
Yeah.
So that is a challenge that some house buyers are finding. But where there's just over 2,000 purchases by the public sector, there's nearly 3,700 purchases that were within the education, health, and social care category. Now, this is going to sound a bit weird. Why would the education or health sector be buying homes? Neither of those are. What I expect this is that it probably falls under the social care category, and it's going to capture approved housing bodies. So approved housing bodies are charities. Which have basically a kind of a social mission. Their social mission is to provide housing for
Peter McVerry would be one of those names, right? That they were
bingo,
doing that.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Threshold. There's a whole bunch of other names for these folks out there. So, like, if you go from 21 to 22 to 23, and you're just looking at this social care sector, 21 they purchased 2,700 homes. In 22 that rose to 3,200, and now we're up to in 2023 3,700. So actually we've been adding, these guys have been buying an extra 500 homes per year on top of what they were buying in previous years.
Yeah.
So this reflects a real ramp up of this sector getting in there, purchasing homes, and then being able to deliver them at affordable rents to people.
And I think a question I'd have, David, and I think this is more relevant again for, let's say, councils with big budgets that can constantly go forward. Less so, I think, against the approved housing bodies. But I think the point still remains is that these are organizations with huge budgets and have the fiscal capacity to buy what they want. How is that distorting and affecting the private buyer who is looking to buy again, possibly a first-time buyer buying their first home, and they're just constantly being outbid by these large, big-budget institutions?
There is a risk of that for sure. I mean, the one thing that's coming back anecdotally now is the idea of bidding wars. That we had a calmer period in 22 and 23, interest rates went up. The other thing that changed was first-time buyers could borrow 4 times multiple.
Yeah.
So that meant that if there is a bidding war, at least the householders, an individual will be able to win it.
Does that data exist? Kind of the bidding war data and also the source of the purchaser?
It doesn't, like the CSO have given this on a national basis. They haven't drilled down into what it is by county, let's say. That would be fascinating to see. I would expect that the bigger
someone who's watching do that or try to find that data. It'd be I think that's really important actually.
Yeah, and the big call would be actually to the CSO to publish that, because I think this is the first time I've seen them split out the public sector number by councils versus approved housing bodies. Although it's not a clean split, it's based on this NACE code split, and I'm kind of telling you what I think that means. If they were to do it by region as well, that could be extra helpful.
Yeah, because I think it's. I mean, I'd also be curious to know, like, all of these. And by the way, just to clarify, I think councils should purchase homes for social housing. I'm not saying that they shouldn't. The balancing to that is that there are people who have worked really hard to save for their deposit and want to get on to the housing ladder. And if they're going to be just constantly outbid by big financial, big public bodies that have, a black hole of cash, that there's a question of fairness and equity in that. And therefore, my question then would be, I would love to know, what are the councils and local authorities' procedures and policies with respect to bidding? How far can they go? Do they consider the other person who's on the other side of the of the purchase? Because then I think, going back to the whole piece around social trust, I remember the person who was close to me who was trying to buy their first home, and they were constantly being outbid. There was a real sense of unfairness about it, and I think that's a big problem.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see if they have some sort of limit on that. If you're bidding, are you able to go more than 10% above what the asking price was? I'm not so sure. We could look into that maybe and come back.
Yeah, because again, there's a public procurement question on that as well, right? Where it's just, oh no, we'll just keep going and go, like have an auto bid, go until you actually secure it. I'd be curious to know, what does that look like? So, yeah. Okay, well, with that, I think we have reached the conclusion of this week's episode. So again, if you did like this episode, please like it, please subscribe to us, and please share to your followers. We are available on the various audio platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. We're also available to watch on YouTube. So again, we really appreciate you watching and listening. Thanks again, and chat to you next week. Take care.